You wake up before dawn. Not because you want to, but because the overseer's stick is already tapping against the stone floor of the slave quarters. The sound echoes through the cramped room where dozens of bodies have spent the night pressed together on thin mats, breathing in the mingled scents of unwashed humanity, damp stone, and something that might once have been soup but now just smells like regret. Your eyes adjust to the darkness, and you see them. The others. Some are already sitting up, rubbing sleep from their eyes. A woman to your left is quietly whispering what might be a prayer in a language you don't recognize. An older man near the wall is coughing, that deep, wet cough that's been getting worse each morning. You wonder how much longer he has. In Rome, sick slaves don't get better, they get replaced. This is your reality. Not as a citizen strolling through marble forums or reclining at elegant dinner parties. Not as a senator debating philosophy or a soldier conquering distant lands. You are property, human chattel. A thing to be bought, sold, worked, and discarded when your usefulness expires. In the Roman Empire, you are one of an estimated 2 to 3 million souls, trapped in a system so vast, so normalized, that even questioning it feels dangerous. The overseer's voice cuts through the morning gloom. Time to work. You stand, your joints protesting from another night on the thin mat. Your tunic, if you can call the rough piece of fabric that, hangs loose on your frame. It's the same one you've worn for weeks, maybe months. Laundry is a luxury reserved for those who own slaves, not for those who are them. Around you, the others are beginning their day. A young woman, maybe 16, carefully ties a strip of cloth around her hair. She arrived 3 weeks ago, sold to pay her family's debts. Her eyes still hold tears some mornings. An older Greek man, once a teacher in his homeland, now bound to tutor the master's children, rolls up his sleeping mat with practiced efficiency. His education makes him valuable. Your strong back makes you useful. The difference between valuable and useful, you've learned, can mean the difference between working in the house and working in the mines. The walk to the fields begins before sunrise. Your feet, hardened by months of walking barefoot over rough stones, carry you through the pre-dawn darkness. The villa looms behind you, its columns and gardens a world apart from your existence. Inside those walls, the family sleeps on soft beds, their slaves maintaining perfect silence as they move about preparing the morning meal. Outside, you join the stream of workers heading to the olive groves, vineyards, and grain fields that keep the empire fed. Roman slavery was not one thing. It was 1,000 different hells, each tailored to the particular needs of the economy and the cruelties of individual masters. You might work in the fields, your back bent over crops under the scorching Mediterranean sun. You might labor in the household, serving wine to masters who debate your fate as casually as they discuss the weather. You might toil in workshops, crafting goods that will bear another's name and bring another's profit. Or, if you were particularly unlucky, you might find yourself in the mines, where the average life expectancy was measured in months, not years. The Romans didn't see slavery as evil. They saw it as natural, as fundamental to civilization as roads or aqueducts. Aristotle had called some humans natural slaves, and Roman society built itself on this foundation. Slaves weren't just workers. They were the invisible engine that made Roman life possible. They cooked the food, built the buildings, educated the children, kept the accounts, performed in the theaters, and died in the arenas. Without slaves, Rome would have collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. As you work in the fields, the sun rises higher, beating down on your back. The overseer rides by on his horse, watching for any sign of slowing down. Your hands, already calloused from months of labor, grip the tools that feel heavier each day. Beside you, a man from Gaul whispers something about home, about children he'll never see again. Another, a woman from Africa, hums quietly to herself, a melody from a life that feels like someone else's dream. The demographics of Roman slavery tell a story of constant conquest and human suffering. War captives formed a massive portion of the slave population. When Roman legions conquered a city, the survivors became property. Entire populations were marched hundreds of miles to Roman markets, families torn apart, sold to different buyers scattered across the empire. But war wasn't the only source. Debt slavery trapped Roman citizens who couldn't pay their obligations. Foundlings, abandoned babies left to die, were often rescued and raised as slaves. Children born to slave mothers became slaves themselves, inheriting bondage like others inherit eye color. The slave markets were theaters of human misery dressed up as commercial enterprise. In Rome's Forum Boarium, slaves stood on platforms, their bodies examined like livestock. Buyers checked teeth, felt muscles, asked about skills and origins. A placard around each slave's neck listed their abilities. Good with numbers, knows Greek, strong back, house-trained. The language reduced human beings to their economic function, and the buyers approached their purchases with the same care they might use selecting a horse or a piece of furniture. You remember your own sale, the platform rough under your bare feet, the auctioneer's voice echoing off the buildings as he listed your qualities, the way potential buyers looked through you, not at you, the moment when someone's bid was accepted, and you realized your life had just been purchased for the equivalent of what a Roman family might spend on a nice dinner party. The walk to your new home in chains, your former life already becoming a memory. Working in the household brought its own complexities. House slaves often lived better than field slaves, with better food, cleaner quarters, and protection from the worst weather. But proximity to the master's family brought different dangers. Roman law gave masters absolute power over their slaves. Sexual abuse was not just common, but legally sanctioned. A master could use any slave, male or female, for sexual purposes without consequence. Female slaves bore children who became the property of their mother's owner, creating new generations bound to serve the children of their fathers and rapists. The violence was systematic and casual. Masters could beat slaves for any reason or no reason at all. They could brand them, chain them, sell them, or kill them. A slave who struck a master faced crucifixion. A slave who killed a master condemned every slave in the household to death, a law that turned slaves into unwilling guardians of their oppressors' safety. Roman literature is filled with casual references to beating slaves, as if violence were as natural as feeding them. Yet, within this system of absolute oppression, small spaces of humanity persisted. Slaves formed relationships, created communities, developed survival strategies that helped them endure the unendurable. In the quarters after the day's work, stories were shared, languages preserved, songs remembered. The woman from Britannia taught the children from Syria words in her native tongue. The man from Egypt showed others how to treat wounds with herbs he remembered from home. Love, friendship, and mutual support flourished in the margins of cruelty. Education created another layer of complexity in the slave system. Educated slaves, particularly Greeks, were highly valued as teachers, doctors, secretaries, and accountants. Some achieved positions of significant responsibility, managing entire households or businesses. But intelligence and skill didn't equal freedom. An educated slave was still property, still subject to the whims of their owner, still liable to be sold or punished at any moment. The afternoon heat becomes unbearable. Sweat streams down your face, stinging your eyes, but you don't stop. the overseer has made it clear that the day's quota must be met, and falling short means a night without food. Around you, others work with the same desperate efficiency. The woman next to you stumbles, clearly exhausted, and you steady her with your free hand. Such small acts of kindness are dangerous. The overseer might see it as plotting, as wasted time, as defiance. But they're also necessary. Without these moments of human connection, the work would be impossible to endure. Roman religion offered slaves little comfort and much additional burden. Slaves were expected to participate in their master's religious observances, honoring gods who seemed to favor only the free. Some found solace in mystery religions that promised better afterlives. Others clung to the gods of their homelands, practicing forbidden rites in secret. Christianity, when it arrived, spoke to slaves with its message of spiritual equality, but it also urged them to accept their earthly condition with patience and obedience. The economy of the Roman Empire rested on slave labor in ways that modern people struggle to comprehend. Slaves worked not just in private homes and farms, but in state-owned mines, quarries, and workshops. They built the roads that connected the empire, constructed the aqueducts that brought water to cities, and served in the bureaucracy that administered Roman rule. The profits from their labor funded the armies that conquered new territories and enslaved new populations, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of expansion and exploitation. Some slaves achieved manumission, the legal process of being freed by their masters. This possibility, however remote, was part of what made Roman slavery distinct from later systems. Masters might free slaves as a reward for loyal service, as part of their will, or even as a business investment, since freed slaves often remained economically tied to their former masters. But manumission was always a gift from the master, never a right of the slave. For every slave who achieved freedom, thousands died in bondage. The legal status of freed slaves remained complicated. They became liberti, freed persons, but they owed continuing obligations to their former masters and could not hold the highest political offices. Their children, however, could become full citizens, creating a pathway from slavery to citizenship that took generations to complete. This system created a complex social hierarchy where former slaves might own current slaves, and the children of slaves might rule over the children of citizens. Evening approaches as you finally trudge back to the slave quarters. Your body aches in ways that have become familiar, each muscle and joint announcing its exhaustion. The simple meal waiting consists of bread, porridge made from whatever grain was cheapest that week, and occasionally some vegetables or watered wine. It's enough to keep you alive and working, nothing more. You eat quickly, efficiently, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same routine. In the growing darkness, conversations begin in hushed tones. Someone has heard rumors that the master might sell some slaves to pay debts. Another whispers about a slave rebellion in a distant province, quickly crushed by Roman legions. Such talk is dangerous, but the need to share information, to feel some small sense of agency in a powerless situation, proves stronger than fear. You listen to fragments of conversation in various languages, each person carrying pieces of worlds the Romans have conquered and enslaved. Rebellion was the ultimate expression of slave resistance, though it was also the ultimate gamble. The most famous slave rebellion, led by Spartacus in 73 to 71 BCE, began with just 70 gladiators but eventually included over 100,000 escaped slaves. For 2 years, they defeated Roman armies and controlled large portions of southern Italy. But their eventual defeat was absolute. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies serving as a warning to any slave who might dream of freedom. Most resistance was smaller, subtler, and more survival-focused. Slaves broke tools, worked slowly when not watched, stole food, and shared information about cruel masters to be avoided. They preserved their native languages and traditions, maintaining cultural identities that slavery sought to erase. Some escaped, though the punishments for captured runaways were severe, ranging from branding to execution. The threat of collective punishment, where all slaves in a household might suffer for one slave's defiance, limited organized resistance, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental human drive toward freedom. The psychological toll of slavery was as devastating as the physical abuse. Slaves lived with constant uncertainty about their future, knowing they could be sold, separated from family, or killed without warning. The dehumanization was systematic, designed to break the spirit as thoroughly as the labor broke the body. Masters used techniques that would be recognized today as psychological torture: isolation, humiliation, arbitrary punishment, and the constant threat of violence. Yet somehow, many slaves maintained their humanity and dignity, despite everything the system did to strip these away. They fell in love, raised children with tenderness, created art, told stories, and dreamed of better lives. The human capacity for resilience in the face of absolute oppression became, perhaps, one of the most remarkable aspects of the slave experience in Rome. As you lie on your thin mat, listening to the breathing of the others around you, you think about home. Not this place, which will never be home no matter how many years you spend here, but the place where you were born free. You remember your mother's voice, your father's hands, the smell of cooking fires, and the sound of children playing. These memories are dangerous because they hurt, but they're also necessary because they remind you who you were before you became property. The woman who prays in the unknown language is at it again, her voice barely audible but somehow comforting. The old man's cough seems worse tonight. Someone's stomach growls loudly in the darkness, a sound that draws no laughter because everyone is equally hungry. This is your family now, these fellow sufferers who share your fate if not your origin. Tomorrow you'll work together, suffer together, and survive together for another day. Roman writers rarely recorded the inner lives of slaves, viewing them as tools rather than people worthy of psychological exploration. But the archaeological record speaks where literature remains silent. Slave quarters, tools, personal items, and even graffiti scratched into walls provide glimpses into lives lived in the shadows of history. A broken doll in slave quarters suggests a child who played despite her bondage. Carved initials on a workshop wall mark a person determined to leave some trace of his existence. Small coins hidden in mattresses reveal slaves who somehow saved tiny amounts despite owning nothing. The sexual exploitation of slaves was so normalized in Roman society that it appears in literature as comedy rather than tragedy. Roman men were expected to use slave women sexually, and doing so was seen as natural exercise of property rights rather than rape. Slave women had no legal recourse and no protection. They bore children who would share their bondage, creating families that existed entirely at their master's discretion. Male slaves faced similar exploitation, particularly young men valued for their appearance. The psychological trauma of such systematic abuse was compounded by the legal and social impossibility of resistance. Education among slaves created a particularly complex form of suffering. Literate slaves often served as secretaries, accountants, or teachers, giving them intimate knowledge of their master's affairs and sometimes considerable practical authority. But their education also made them acutely aware of their powerlessness, able to read the laws that defined them as property and the literature that celebrated the freedom they could never possess. Greek slaves, many of them well educated before their enslavement, faced the particular irony of teaching Roman children about freedom and citizenship they themselves could never enjoy. The morning comes too soon, as it always does. The overseer's stick taps again against the stone, and you rise with the others, beginning another day identical to yesterday and the day before that. Your body protests, but it moves anyway, trained by months or years of repetition. You've learned to conserve energy, to work hard enough to avoid punishment, but not so hard as to exhaust yourself before the day ends. It's a careful calculation that every slave master, a mathematics of survival taught by necessity and fear. The Romans justified slavery through philosophy and religion, arguing that it was part of the natural order established by the gods. Slaves were seen as lacking the rational capacity for self-governance, making their subjugation not just practical but morally correct. This ideology was reinforced through education, literature, and law, creating a society where questioning slavery was almost unthinkable for most free Romans. Even when individual masters were criticized for cruelty, the institution itself remained beyond serious challenge. Economic factors made slavery central to Roman prosperity in ways that went beyond simple labor. Slaves were investments that could be bought, sold, rented, and inherited. They appeared on balance sheets alongside livestock and land. Their children increased their owner's wealth. Their skills and training added value that could be monetized. The entire Roman economy was structured around the assumption of abundant, cheap labor that could be worked without regard for human cost. The diversity of the slave population was staggering. The same household might include Germanic warriors captured in battle, Greek intellectuals sold for debt, African craftsmen taken in raids, and children born into bondage from previous generations of slaves. Each brought different languages, skills, traditions, and survival strategies. The mixing of cultures in slave quarters created new hybrid traditions, as people from across the known world shared their knowledge and adapted to their common fate. Religious practices among slaves often blended traditions from their homelands with Roman requirements. A slave from Egypt might honor Isis in private, while publicly participating in ceremonies honoring Jupiter. These syncretic practices allowed slaves to maintain spiritual connections to their origins while navigating the religious demands of their masters. Some mystery religions, particularly Mithraism and early Christianity, explicitly welcomed slaves and promised spiritual equality that earthly law denied. The afternoon brings a change in routine. A messenger arrives from the main house, and the overseer calls several slaves aside for selection. Your stomach clenches as you watch, knowing that any interruption in the usual pattern could mean sale, punishment, or worse. The woman who prays is chosen, along with 3 others. They're marched toward the villa, their faces carefully blank. You may never see them again. In the world of slavery, people disappear regularly, suddenly, without explanation or farewell. The emotional bonds between slaves were both a source of strength and vulnerability. Friendships, romantic relationships, and surrogate family structures provided crucial psychological support, but they also created new avenues for masters to exercise control. The threat of separation, of having loved ones sold or punished, kept slaves compliant even when they might have been willing to risk their own safety for freedom. Masters understood this dynamic and used it ruthlessly, making examples of some slaves to control others. Medical care for slaves was purely economic. Masters invested in healing slaves the same way they maintained tools or buildings, seeking to preserve their investment rather than relieve suffering. Sick slaves who couldn't work quickly became expenses rather than assets. Some wealthy households employed slave doctors, often Greeks with significant medical training, but their primary responsibility was keeping the workforce functional. Pain, disability, and chronic illness that didn't prevent work were ignored. Slaves who became too old or sick to be productive faced abandonment or sale to masters who specialized in working the dying until they collapsed. The legal system offered slaves no protection and considerable peril. They could not testify in court except under torture, based on the Roman belief that slaves would only tell the truth when suffering extreme pain. They could not own property, enter contracts, or make legal claims. A slave who witnessed a crime against their master was required to report it or face death. The law assumed that slaves were naturally deceptive and dangerous, requiring constant vigilance and harsh punishment to maintain order. Some slaves achieved positions of considerable responsibility within their masters' households or businesses. Slave accountants managed vast sums of money they could never own. Slave overseers directed the work of other slaves, creating hierarchies within bondage that sometimes led to greater cruelty, as enslaved people competed for their master's favor. Slave craftsmen created beautiful objects that brought their owners fame and profit while receiving no recognition for their skill. These positions of relative privilege within the slave system created complex loyalties and resentments that masters exploited to maintain control. Evening brings you back to the quarters. Another day survived. The woman who was taken earlier has not returned, confirming your fears about her fate. Someone new has taken her sleeping spot. A young man with the hollow look of recent capture. He speaks a language no one recognizes, but the universal language of grief needs no translation. Others gather around him, offering silent comfort and practical advice about survival in their shared situation. The psychological strategies slaves developed for coping with their situation were as varied as the slaves themselves. Some found strength in maintaining fierce inner dignity despite outward submission. Others created rich fantasy lives, imagining different futures or dwelling on memories of freedom. Many turned to religion, finding hope in promises of divine justice or afterlife rewards. Some focused on protecting or helping other slaves, creating meaning through service to their community. A few maintained dreams of escape or rebellion, though acting on such dreams was usually fatal. Cultural preservation became a form of resistance among enslaved populations. Languages, songs, stories, and traditions from conquered territories were maintained in secret, passed down through generations of slaves who refused to let their origins be completely erased. Roman masters generally didn't care what slaves did with their limited free time, as long as it didn't interfere with work or threaten security. This indifference created small spaces where enslaved people could maintain connections to their identities beyond their status as property. The training of new slaves was a systematic process designed to break resistance and create compliant workers. Newly captured or purchased slaves were often isolated, poorly fed, and subjected to random punishments to establish their powerlessness. They were given new names, Roman names that erased their original identities. They were taught the minimum Latin necessary for following orders and warned of the consequences of disobedience. Those who adapted quickly might be rewarded with better positions or living conditions. Those who resisted faced escalating brutality until they submitted or died. Sexual relationships between slaves existed in a complex web of desire, survival, and mutual support. While masters could exploit any slave sexually, slaves also formed genuine romantic attachments to each other. These relationships provided emotional sustenance but also created new vulnerabilities. Children born from such unions belonged to the mother's master, and families could be separated at any time through sale or gift. Some couples managed to stay together for years, creating stable relationships within unstable circumstances. Others were torn apart without warning, their love becoming another casualty of the slave system. The contradiction between Roman ideals of virtue and dignity and the reality of slavery was managed through careful mental compartmentalization. Romans celebrated freedom, honor, and human dignity in their literature and philosophy, while simultaneously owning human beings. They resolved this contradiction by defining slaves as fundamentally different from free people, lacking the rational capacity that made freedom meaningful. This ideology was so deeply ingrained that even freed slaves often accepted it, viewing their former bondage as justified by their earlier lack of virtue or wisdom. As you settle into sleep, your mind drifts to the question that haunts every slave. Will tomorrow be different? Not different in the sense of better or worse work, better or worse food, but different in the fundamental sense of freedom. It's a dangerous thought because hope is dangerous in a hopeless situation. Yet the human mind refuses to accept permanent powerlessness, even when all evidence supports that acceptance. You dream, as slaves have always dreamed, of walking away from this place and never looking back. The Roman economy's dependence on slavery created a system that was both incredibly productive and fundamentally unstable. The abundance of slave labor discouraged technological innovation, since human muscle was cheaper than mechanical solutions. It created a leisured class that could pursue politics, philosophy, and arts, while others performed all necessary work. But it also created a massive population with no stake in Roman success, no reason to defend the system that oppressed them, and every reason to welcome its destruction. Military service offered one of the few paths from slavery to citizenship for male slaves. Slaves who served in the legions, though this was technically illegal, could sometimes earn freedom through their service. During times of military crisis, slaves were occasionally freed en masse to serve as soldiers, though this was always seen as a desperate measure. Former slaves who achieved citizenship through military service often displayed fierce loyalty to Rome, perhaps because their freedom felt more precious having been earned through service and danger. The economics of manumission created perverse incentives throughout the slave system. Masters sometimes promised freedom to encourage productivity, then found excuses to avoid honoring those promises. Some freed slaves only in their wills, ensuring years of service motivated by hope that might be disappointed by a simple document change. Others freed slaves but required them to continue working for wages so low they remained economically dependent. The possibility of freedom was used as a tool of control almost as often as the threat of punishment. Women in slavery faced particular vulnerabilities that compounded the general horrors of bondage. Beyond sexual exploitation, they often bore and raised children who would share their fate, creating emotional bonds that masters could manipulate. Pregnant slaves were valued for the future labor they carried, but they received no special care beyond what was necessary to protect the investment. Women who became too old for reproductive value faced the same abandonment as other slaves who lost their economic utility. The cultural impact of slavery on Roman society went far beyond economics. The presence of millions of enslaved people from across the known world brought new languages, religions, artistic traditions, and technologies to Rome. Many Roman cultural achievements were actually the work of enslaved artisans, writers, teachers, and performers, whose contributions were credited to their masters. The mixing of cultures in Roman households and workshops created new hybrid traditions that influenced everything from architecture to cuisine. Another dawn arrives, as inevitable as the work it brings. Your body, hardened by months of labor, rises automatically. The routine has become so ingrained that conscious thought is almost unnecessary. You dress, if putting on the same worn tunic can be called dressing, and join the silent procession toward another day of unpaid labor. The faces around you change as slaves are sold, die, or occasionally escape, but the rhythm of oppression remains constant. Escape attempts were rare, but not unknown, despite the severe punishments awaiting captured runaways. Some slaves fled to join brigand bands in remote areas, choosing the dangers of an outlaw life over the certainties of bondage. Others tried to blend into the urban poor of large cities, though their lack of legal status made this extremely dangerous. A few managed to reach territories beyond Roman control, though this usually meant leaving behind any family or friends who remained enslaved. The decision to run required extraordinary courage, because failure meant not just personal suffering, but often collective punishment for other slaves. The psychological techniques masters used to maintain control were sophisticated and cruel. They created hierarchies among slaves, giving some authority over others to prevent unified resistance. They encouraged competition for resources and privileges, making slaves complicit in each other's oppression. They used random acts of kindness to create confusion about their true nature, making slaves grateful for basic humanity. Most effectively, they made slaves responsible for each other's behavior, ensuring that any individual rebellion would harm the entire slave community. Religious consolation was one of the few sources of comfort available to most slaves, but even this was complicated by their powerless status. Traditional Roman religion offered little hope for divine intervention in earthly affairs, emphasizing instead the importance of accepting one's station in life. Mystery religions promised spiritual equality and eventual cosmic justice, but they also counseled patience and submission in the present world. Early Christianity spoke directly to slave experiences with its emphasis on suffering and eventual divine vindication. But it also urged slaves to obey their masters as they would obey God. The process of dehumanization was gradual but thorough, designed to make both slaves and masters accept the fundamental premise that some humans were naturally suited for bondage. Slaves were given numbers or names that reflected their function rather than their identity. They were bought and sold in markets alongside livestock. They were described in literature using the same language applied to animals or tools. This linguistic and social transformation was essential to maintaining a system that contradicted basic human empathy and recognition. Education created its own form of torment for slaves who possessed it. Literate slaves often served as secretaries or tutors, giving them intimate knowledge of the affairs and thoughts of their masters. They could read the laws that defined them as property, the literature that celebrated freedom they could never possess, and the correspondence that treated them as commodities. Their intelligence made them valuable, but also dangerous in their master's eyes, subject to particular scrutiny and control. Greek slaves, many of them well educated before their capture, faced the special irony of teaching Roman children about citizenship and virtue they themselves could never exercise. The workday unfolds with familiar brutality. Your hands, permanently shaped by the tools you've been forced to use, perform their tasks with mechanical efficiency. Around you, others work with the same grim determination. The sun climbs higher, promising another day of heat and exhaustion. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, struggles with a load too heavy for his small frame. You help him when the overseer's attention is elsewhere, knowing that tomorrow someone else might help you when your strength fails. Family structures among slaves were both treasured refuges and sources of additional vulnerability. Marriages between slaves had no legal recognition, but often provided crucial emotional support and practical cooperation. Children born into slavery learned survival strategies from their parents, while also absorbing the psychological damage of growing up as property. Some slave families remained together for years, creating stable units within an unstable system. Others were torn apart by sale or gift, their bonds severed by economic calculations that saw no value in human affection. The sexual exploitation of slaves was so normalized that Roman literature treats it as comedy rather than crime. Young male slaves were particularly vulnerable, valued for their appearance and availability. Female slaves faced constant threat of rape from masters, guests, and overseers. Children born from these encounters belonged to their mother's owner, creating new generations of slaves who were often the biological children of the masters who owned them. The psychological trauma of systematic sexual abuse was compounded by its legal and social invisibility, making recovery and resistance almost impossible. Medical care for slaves reflected their status as valuable property rather than suffering humans. Masters invested in slave health the same way they maintained buildings or equipment, seeking to preserve their investment rather than relieve pain. Epidemic diseases that threatened entire slave populations received attention, while individual chronic conditions were largely ignored unless they affected productivity. Slave doctors, often Greeks with excellent training, focused on keeping the workforce functional rather than promoting genuine wellness. Pain that didn't prevent work was considered irrelevant. The legal framework surrounding slavery was designed to protect masters' property rights while denying slaves any form of protection or recourse. Slaves could not testify in court except under torture, reflecting the Roman belief that only extreme pain would force truth from naturally deceptive beings. They could not own property, enter contracts, or make legal complaints. A slave who harmed a free person faced death, while a free person who killed a slave faced only financial penalty to the owner. This legal structure reinforced the fundamental premise that slaves were objects rather than people. Resistance took many forms beyond the dramatic rebellions that captured historical attention. Slaves worked slowly when not closely supervised, broke tools through apparent clumsiness, stole food and other necessities, and spread information about cruel masters to be avoided. They maintained cultural practices from their homelands, preserved languages that slavery sought to erase, and created support networks that helped individuals survive psychological and physical trauma. These small acts of defiance were dangerous, but essential for maintaining human dignity in dehumanizing circumstances. The afternoon heat becomes unbearable, but the work continues. Your tunic clings to your sweating body, and dust coats your throat until breathing becomes difficult. The overseer seeks shade while keeping his whip visible, a constant reminder of the consequences of slowing down. Around you, others show signs of exhaustion, but no one dares to stop. You've learned to recognize the signs of heat exhaustion in yourself and others. Knowledge that sometimes means the difference between surviving the day and collapsing in the field. The psychology of slavery created lasting damage that extended far beyond the period of bondage itself. Freed slaves often struggled with decision-making after years of having every choice made for them. They faced suspicion from freeborn Romans who viewed former slaves as permanently tainted by their earlier status. Children born into slavery often internalized the ideology that justified their oppression, accepting their inferior status as natural and deserved. The mental habits necessary for survival in slavery, including constant vigilance and suppression of personal desires, were difficult to abandon even when no longer necessary. Cultural synthesis occurred in slave quarters where people from across the Roman world shared their traditions and adapted to common circumstances. African religious practices blended with Germanic rituals and Greek philosophies to create new hybrid traditions. Languages mixed and evolved as speakers of different tongues found ways to communicate. Survival strategies were shared and refined, creating bodies of knowledge that helped enslaved people navigate their dangerous circumstances. These cultural developments often influenced the broader Roman society, though slaves received no credit for their contributions. Economic calculations drove every aspect of slave management, from initial purchase through daily treatment to eventual disposal. Masters weighed the costs of food, housing, and medical care against the expected productive output of each slave. They calculated the optimal balance between punishment and reward to maximize compliance while minimizing rebellion. They planned for the replacement of slaves who died or became too old to work efficiently. These cold economic assessments treated human beings as depreciating assets to be exploited until their value was exhausted. The religious life of slaves developed in the shadows of Roman religious practice, often syncretizing traditions from their homelands with the requirements imposed by their masters. Slaves were expected to participate in their masters' religious observances, but often maintained private devotions to gods from their origins. Mystery religions like Mithraism and Christianity offered spiritual equality that earthly law denied, but they also counseled patience and submission in the present world. Religious practices became one of the few areas where slaves could exercise some personal choice, though even this was subject to their master's oversight. Evening returns you to the slave quarters. Another day survived through endurance and cooperation. The faces around you tell stories of exhaustion and determination, of small victories and devastating losses. Someone has received news of a family member sold to a distant province. Another has learned that their child will be trained for gladiatorial combat. These fragments of information circulate through whispered conversations, creating a network of shared knowledge that helps everyone prepare for possible futures. The manumission process was designed to benefit masters as much as slaves, creating a system where freedom became another tool of control. Masters might promise freedom to encourage productivity, then find excuses to delay or deny it. They might free slaves in their wills, ensuring decades of motivated service while retaining the option to change their minds. Some freed slaves only to require continued service at subsistence wages, creating economic bondage that replaced legal slavery. The possibility of freedom was used to extract maximum value from enslaved people who might otherwise have been less cooperative. Technological stagnation was one of the hidden costs of Rome's reliance on slave labor. The abundance of cheap human workers discouraged investment in labor-saving devices or innovative production methods. Why develop mechanical solutions when human muscle was readily available and infinitely replaceable? This technological conservatism may have contributed to Rome's eventual economic decline, as other societies that relied more on free labor and technological innovation became more competitive in certain sectors. The social structure of slave communities was complex and sometimes hierarchical, reflecting both shared oppression and individual survival strategies. House slaves often looked down on field slaves, while skilled slaves might consider themselves superior to unskilled laborers. These divisions were encouraged by masters who understood that united slaves posed greater threats than divided ones. Yet, despite these tensions, slave communities also demonstrated remarkable solidarity in times of crisis, sharing resources and protection when individuals faced particular dangers. Family separation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the slave system, destroying human bonds that provided essential emotional support in an otherwise hopeless situation. Masters understood the power of these relationships and used them strategically, threatening separation to ensure compliance while occasionally allowing families to remain together as a reward for exceptional service. The constant uncertainty about whether loved ones would be sold, given away, or simply moved to different parts of an estate created chronic anxiety that undermined the psychological stability that family relationships might otherwise have provided. Children born into slavery faced particular psychological challenges as they grew old enough to understand their status. Parents struggled with the impossible task of preparing their children for a life of bondage while somehow preserving their humanity and dignity. Some tried to shield their children from the full reality of their situation, creating brief periods of relative innocence that would inevitably be shattered. Others chose to teach survival skills early, believing that harsh preparation was kinder than devastating surprise. Either approach carried enormous emotional costs for both parents and children. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural work created temporary variations in the relentless routine of slave life. Harvest time brought longer hours and more intense labor, but also slightly better food as masters sought to maintain peak productivity during crucial periods. Winter offered some respite from field work, but brought new challenges as slaves were assigned to indoor tasks like repairing tools, processing stored crops, or working in workshops. These seasonal changes provided small markers in the otherwise undifferentiated passage of time, moments when slaves could hope for slightly different circumstances, even if their fundamental status remained unchanged. Urban slaves often faced different challenges from their rural counterparts, navigating the complex social hierarchies of Roman cities while remaining legally powerless. They might work in shops, workshops, or private homes, bringing them into contact with free Romans who could be customers, neighbors, or casual observers of their daily lives. This visibility created both opportunities and dangers, as urban slaves might find protectors among free people while also facing greater scrutiny of their behavior and movements. The anonymity possible in large cities occasionally allowed slaves to escape or live as if free, though discovery meant severe punishment. The intellectual capacity of slaves was both valued and feared by their masters, creating complex dynamics around education and knowledge. Greek slaves were particularly prized for their learning, often serving as teachers, doctors, or secretaries in wealthy households. But intelligence in a slave was always threatening, representing potential for deception, rebellion, or simply understanding the injustice of their situation too clearly. Masters wanted smart slaves who could perform complex tasks, but not so smart that they might organize resistance or develop ideas about freedom and dignity that threatened the system. Religious festivals provided some of the few breaks in the grinding routine of slave life, though even these celebrations were filtered through the lens of bondage. During certain Roman holidays, slaves might be given extra food, relieved of some duties, or allowed to participate in public festivities. The Saturnalia festival temporarily reversed social roles, allowing slaves to mock their masters and enjoy brief moments of symbolic freedom. But these celebrations also reinforced the normal order by highlighting its temporary suspension, making clear that slave freedom was a novelty rather than a right. The night brings familiar sounds, whispered conversations, quiet weeping, the rustle of straw as someone tries to find a comfortable position on the hard floor. Sleep comes fitfully, interrupted by dreams of home, nightmares of punishment, or the simple discomfort of too many bodies in too small a space. You've learned to sleep through almost anything, a skill that serves as both survival mechanism and symbol of how thoroughly the system has shaped your existence. Even rest is not truly restful when you remain always alert to the possibility of sudden summons or unexpected danger. The geographic diversity of the Roman Empire meant that slaves came from vastly different cultural backgrounds, speaking different languages, practicing different religions, and carrying different survival skills. This diversity was both challenge and resource for slave communities, as people struggled to communicate and cooperate across cultural divides while also learning from each other's knowledge and strategies. A slave from Britain might teach others about herb lore, while someone from Egypt could share techniques for working in extreme heat. These exchanges created new hybrid cultures that blended traditions from across the known world. The treatment of elderly and disabled slaves revealed the purely economic logic that governed the system. Slaves who could no longer work effectively were often abandoned, sold cheaply to buyers who specialized in extracting final value from failing laborers, or simply allowed to die without medical care. Some masters showed what they considered kindness by allowing old slaves to remain in familiar surroundings while performing light duties. But this was always a business decision based on calculations about cost and benefit, rather than genuine compassion for human suffering. Military slaves served in support roles with Roman armies, maintaining equipment, building fortifications, and providing various services to soldiers. Their status was particularly precarious because they lived on the edges of battlefields where death was common and escape opportunities were limited. Some gained freedom through exceptional service during military campaigns, but most remained trapped in a system that used their labor to support the very armies that had conquered their homelands and enslaved their people. The morning arrives with mechanical precision. Another day in an endless sequence that stretches behind and ahead of you without clear beginning or foreseeable end. Your body moves through the familiar motions of rising, dressing, and preparing for work, while your mind retreats to whatever internal space it has learned to protect from the daily assault of dehumanization. This psychological withdrawal is both survival strategy and tragedy, allowing you to endure each day while gradually losing pieces of yourself that may never be recovered. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters reveals traces of the inner lives that Roman literature largely ignored. Personal items hidden in walls or buried under floors suggest that slaves maintained private possessions despite officially owning nothing. Religious objects, jewelry, and even children's toys indicate that human desires for beauty, meaning, and play persisted despite systematic attempts to reduce people to their labor value. These material traces provide poignant testimony to the persistence of humanity under conditions designed to destroy it. The breeding of slaves was discussed and practiced with the same casual efficiency applied to livestock management, treating human reproduction as another source of profit for masters. Female slaves of childbearing age were valued not only for their immediate labor, but for their potential to produce new workers. Children born into slavery were often separated from their mothers at young ages to prevent the formation of strong emotional bonds that might complicate their training and control. This systematic destruction of family relationships was justified through ideologies that portrayed slaves as lacking the emotional capacity for meaningful human connections. Skilled artisan slaves created many of the beautiful objects that decorated wealthy Roman homes and public spaces. Working in pottery workshops, metalworking shops, and textile mills that produced goods for both local use and long-distance trade. Their expertise was valuable enough that some were given considerable autonomy in their work, but they remained property whose creations brought fame and wealth to their masters, while they themselves received no recognition for their artistic achievements. The irony was particularly sharp for slaves who created luxury items they could never own, or public artworks they could never fully enjoy. The legal doctrine that slaves were talking tools reflected and reinforced their dehumanized status throughout Roman society, creating a framework that justified treating human beings as objects while maintaining the fiction that this treatment was natural and morally acceptable. This legal language shaped how slaves were bought, sold, inherited, and disposed of, creating bureaucratic systems that processed human suffering with administrative efficiency. The paperwork of slavery, contracts, bills of sale, and inventory lists provides chilling evidence of how thoroughly the system normalized the commodification of people. Educational opportunities for slave children were determined entirely by their potential economic value to their masters, creating cruel situations where intelligent children might be trained for responsible positions while remaining forever trapped in bondage. Some received excellent educations that would have been envied by many free children, learning multiple languages, mathematics, literature, and specialized skills. But this education was always a form of investment rather than gift, designed to increase the slaves' value rather than develop their human potential for its own sake. The afternoon heat becomes oppressive, pressing down on the working slaves like a physical weight that makes every movement more difficult. Sweat streams down faces and backs, stinging eyes and making tools slippery in tired hands. The overseer's vigilance never wavers, his presence a constant reminder that exhaustion is not an excuse for slowing down. You've learned to pace yourself, conserving energy for the long hours ahead while maintaining the appearance of sustained effort that keeps punishment at bay. Transport of slaves across the empire was a massive logistical operation that moved hundreds of thousands of people annually from conquest zones to market centers and final destinations. Ships specially designed for human cargo packed slaves into holds with minimal space, food, and fresh air, accepting high mortality rates as inevitable costs of doing business. Overland routes forced chained gangs to march hundreds of miles, with the weak abandoned along the way when they could no longer keep pace. These journeys separated slaves forever from their homelands, while providing them with horrific introductions to their new status as property. The development of specialized slave markets in major cities created institutional structures that normalized and systematized human trafficking on an enormous scale. Professional slave dealers developed expertise in evaluating, training, and marketing human beings, creating standardized practices for an inherently barbaric business. Market days brought together buyers and sellers who discussed the relative merits of different slaves with the same casual expertise they might apply to evaluating horses or furniture, treating the most intimate aspects of human identity as commercial variables. Punishment systems for slaves were designed to be public spectacles that terrorized entire slave populations while satisfying masters' desires for revenge and control. Crucifixion, flogging, branding, and other tortures were performed where other slaves could witness them, creating climates of fear that extended far beyond the individual being punished. The randomness of much punishment was deliberate, teaching slaves that safety depended entirely on their master's whims rather than their own behavior, making resistance seem not just dangerous but futile.